Aaron Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a privilege to start and talk on the first reading of this bill, the non-bank deposit bill, sponsored and will go through to the Finance and Expenditure Committee. I mean, as mentioned by earlier speakers, this bill is a continuation of the movement towards sensible regulation of the wider finance and investment sector, and it's one that we wholeheartedly support. Mr Speaker, I think there's a couple of interesting things and analogies I just wanted to quickly touch on. One is the comparison between this bill and an earlier bill that came before this House last year on the insurance prudential bill, which actually has now been working in place for about 12 months. And that was shown to be very, very useful, particularly in the recent earthquakes that hit Christchurch and in relation to the underlying prudential security of the insurance companies in Christchurch, Mr Speaker. And prior to that bill coming into place, there was no prudential security for the insurance sector. And a bit like this for the finance companies, there's been some holes in the finance company prudential regime, and that this bill will actually be the last plank to resolve those, Mr Speaker. And one of the ones that I quite particularly like is the issue of increasing the information disclosure that the powers that the Reserve Bank has on the non-bank deposit lenders and particularly on the directors and officers of those entities. And there's a really interesting little hook here in relation to the ability to have consent from the Reserve Bank in relation to purchasing of equity in underlying entities. Particularly, the Reserve Bank will have to have consent on more than 20% of the equity changing hands. That's very similar to what applies to under the Takeover Code under a code company for a normal entity, whether it's a non-bank lending business. And I think that's a good step forward. It strengthens if you are a non-bank deposit lender. You're treated very similar to what it is under a takeovers code type entity, and that's a sensible step forward given that many of these finance companies rely on the investments of mums and dads out there who generally speaking, need a bit of help from governments to put in place a prudential regime, because we've had a number of instances of people committing, actually, in some cases, actually fraud, Mr Speaker, and that's actually been outrageous. We needed to strengthen that sector. This week in particular, we've seen some of the results of financial turmoil around the world, and we've got riots in London still occurring today, Mr Speaker, and financial markets being very volatile, both up and down. And in those situations, Mr Speaker, the issues of finance company are those second and third tier type lenders and those non-bank deposits takers. People need comfort that those entities are giving their money to do have a regime which puts in place some security for their funds they're lending, particularly given that most of those entities do lend to fringe commercial operators. We've seen that in terms of commercial property development. There are a number of very high-profile cases of property development failure, particularly in the South Island and around Queenstown. There's some very big white elephants that were funded, and in Auckland as well, where property developers had money lent to them into company in many cases from finance companies, and those funds were lost because of the lack of transparency and lack of knowledge that lenders to those businesses and the borrowers did have. And this bill will actually allow more information to go back to the Reserve Bank to give back to those punters, so they are more clear that their funds are actually being invested in the way that they intended them to be. It doesn't actually tie in and put into place a regime which is as strict as some would like, Mr Speaker, and that'll be an interesting debate that we will have, I'm sure, in the Select Committee. Some will want to tighten up even further this prudential regime, and that'll be an interesting situation to see when we get the submissions come forward. And I suspect others will think this is too tight a regime in a sector which has historically had a lot of laissez-faire type rules around it, but we've seen that we do need to do something, Mr Speaker, and that is the right step forward. Look, finally, I just want to say that there is a number of other bits of prudential security bills that are coming through, and particularly around the security reform and things like that. There's a financial summit on tomorrow, Mr Speaker, that's been mentioned previously, and that will be an interesting outcome to sort of see what comes out of that, and any other forms of legislation that may be required or rules, Mr Speaker. And we all support those that might come out and support people to go to that summit and put forward any other further ideas on financial sector reform so we can protect those funds and mums and dads out there, Mr Speaker. Thank you.
I call the honourable member Brendan